Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on how Fair Workweek laws are addressing the economic challenges and harms caused by growing part-time worker underemployment in the U.S. I'd like to first by introducing my colleagues who will be joining us in our discussion today. Presenting his paper, The Involuntary Part-Time Work and Underemployment Problem in the U.S., we're joined by Lonnie Golden, Professor of Economics and Labor Employment Relations at Penn State University. Next, we're joined by Julie Votman, Director of Job Quality and Senior Counsel for the National Women's Law Center. At the National Women's Law Center, Julie works on a range of issues involving job quality and support for low-income women and their families, including minimum wage and overtime pay, fair scheduling policies, and childcare assistance. Last but not least, we're joined by Rachel Deutsch, Supervising Attorney for Worker Justice at the Center for Popular Democracy. Rachel supports CBD's campaigns to enact and enforce strong workplace protections and is a nationally recognized expert on the design and implementation of Fair Workweek policies to promote stable, predictable schedules and opportunities for full-time employment. To start, I wanted to present a report to give a little context on Fair Workweek laws and policies and unpredictable scheduling. According to the Federal Reserve's report on the economic well-being of U.S. households in 2020, 1 in 4 workers report that their schedules vary based on the needs of their employer. And workers in low-wage jobs and part-time workers are disproportionately represented among those with unpredictable schedules. Unpredictable scheduling is largely a product of just-in-time management practices, a tactic used by employers for keeping costs low, while also matching staff supply with operational needs and the demands for services. This means workers typically receive their schedules on short notice and may have their shifts changed or canceled at the last minute. Employers may put employers on call with no promise that there will be work available for them or send workers home without pay. Demand has slowed by the time they arrive for their shift. This frequently means that workers aren't guaranteed a minimum number of hours per week, thus access to hours becomes difficult. Just-in-time management practices are often used in restaurant, retail, and hospitality sectors, largely low-wage sectors as well. Sadly, unpredictable schedules have serious effects on the well-being of individuals and families and are linked to adverse business consequences and result in broad economic costs. It makes it difficult for employees to schedule everything else in their lives, from dentist appointments to second jobs. This is particularly challenging for parents who have to arrange childcare without advance notice of when they will have to be at work, and workers earning low wages who are also disproportionately people of color. As a byproduct of unpredictable scheduling, involuntary part-time work and underemployment has been a prevalent issue in the U.S. labor market, harming workers earning low wages and workers of color more disparately. Underemployment, as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics under the indicator part-time for economic reasons, represents a group of workers who are part-time but who want and are available to work full-time hours. While the rates for underemployment saw a gradual drop during the economic recovery that followed the Great Recession and before the economic devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic, new research using a broader measure of underemployment reveals a gloomier picture of underemployed workers in the economy overall. By implication, underemployed part-time workers experience the hardships and restraints associated with systemic declines in job quality and may be tied to ongoing structural changes in low-wage labor markets, such as domestic outsourcing, scheduling technologies, or shifting bargaining power and deunionization. Together, underemployment and volatile schedules create larger challenges for workers already struggling with low-paying jobs. To curb some of the causes and harms of underemployment and unpredictable scheduling, state and local governments have passed laws addressing unstable and unpredictable scheduling practices. They include provisions ensuring that large employers give employees minimum advance notice of their schedules and are compensated for late changes to their schedules or for having less than a minimum rest time between shifts. A recognition of these emerging trends, coupled with reduced bargaining power and eroding job quality measures, have created demand for laws that address these issues in several states and localities such as New York City, Oregon, Seattle, and Philadelphia. Recognizing the various challenges workers are facing, these laws reflect the urgent need workers have for scheduling predictability, and are an imperative step in combating the effects of unpredictable scheduling and involuntary part-time work. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Lonnie Golden, who will be presenting this paper.
Thank you, Adewale. Great to be here. Great to see some of my favorite people in the audience. And I want to thank first the Center for Law and Social Policy, which Adewale is representing. They funded the work and approached me and Jae Sung, my co-author, who is currently in Korea, where it's, I believe, 1:35 a.m. So we let him off the hook for doing the presentation today. Some of us could do it at 1:35, but I wouldn't ask anybody else to do that. And we're trying to fit the pure research that we're trying to do, the empirical research that we're trying to do, with the important policy work that CLASP and Rachel and Julie are doing. So we're trying to inform that with policy. Underemployment, this sort of amorphous term is something we'll define and try to measure a little bit more precisely, but it's now being discovered by economists and banks that are now going to watch the involuntary part-time workforce as an indicator of how much and among whom the current recovery is taking place. So the three things we'll be looking at in this presentation is basically how pervasive underemployment is. Why should we care about it? In other words, what are some of its effects? And I'll look at several of them. And I'll be happy to send you the whole PowerPoint and the paper, which is in R&R mode, which looks at it a little bit more in depth than I'll be able to verbalize today. And then finally, to pass it over to our policy advocates and experts about how we could address this with policy. So what we mean by underemployment, specifically in this case, is time-related underemployment, the way the ILO thinks of it, which is that there's a segment of the workforce that's willing and available to engage in some number of hours beyond what they're currently working, beyond some threshold, whatever the standard work week is for the country or in their organization. But more generally, it's part of the hours mismatch problem, that people don't get the hours they prefer. They're working. We know that this is obviously something that's going on right now, where some people are working more than they might prefer, but we're going to be focusing on the people that work too few below their choice or preference. And the main reason we think of this as a problem that needs to be addressed with policy is that it's flying a bit under the radar, that some people are not back to being as fully employed as they were before, and that their hours are inadequate, which basically translates into their income being inadequate, and that there's this triple whammy for part-time people, that not only have, if they're working at involuntarily short hours, that they have less income than they might feel is adequate, but they also are facing some of the characteristics of part-time work, and that their schedules are last minute, their number of hours are unstable. And as I found with Larry Michel at EPI, that there's a pay penalty for working part-time that's even reinforced by shorter and shorter hours, or having involuntary hours. To be the labor economist in the room, we want to identify what some of the underlying sources of these are. They can be cyclical. That's what we're experiencing nationally right now, that folks are having their hours shortened or shorter than they prefer because of the state of the economy, the state of labor demand, particularly in their industry. There's also a contributing side on the labor supply side, a contributing factor that even people that have stable hours might want to be working more hours than they were previously, and therefore be underemployed. But we're also especially interested in LIRA and the structural sources, the rise of fissuring, the just-in-time scheduling practices, the built-in institutional sources of deunionization, which destabilize and destandardize working hours, and not so much focus on the factors here that contribute to these, but these underlie why there might be underemployment. and how to address them ultimately. As Adewale suggested in the introduction, the most closely tracked version of underemployment, we're going to suggest grossly underestimates its presence and prevalence. And they define it at the BLS as part-time for economic reasons. They actually refuse to call it involuntary, even though everybody translates it as such. They just identify by asking people why they're working part-time. And the major two reasons are business conditions or slack work, or that part-time was all they could find. And we call that informally as involuntary part-time. We're going to try to create a measure called part-time underemployment. Any case, you can see the actual pattern here over the last 15 or so years, the spike during the Great Recession, the slow, gradual recovery, where I'll give you the percentages on the next slide. It's a little bit more meaningful. That was the head count. But the main factor we're seeing is this giant spike that occurred, this in the pandemic shutdown, some of it self-induced, and the gradual recovery since then. But it's not fully recovered, just like experienced after the Great Recession. It bottomed out at 2.6% in 2019 and is still elevated. And what the CPS data cannot be used for, the way it's currently structured, is to generate an estimate of involuntary part-time working among the part-time who don't necessarily want full-time hours. That's a very important subgroup, but that's what in part motivates us to look at this issue a little bit more in depth and dive a little bit deeper. Also, the way it's measured is that people who say they're willing, able, but not available for full-time work are considered voluntary or economic reasons for part-time, non-economic reasons. And one of the reasons that can be identified is they don't have sufficient childcare or family obligations or other types of coverage, and therefore are excluded from this measure. So one of our three motivations is going to be that we could measure this a little bit more comprehensively beyond what the BLS includes in their U6 measure to gauge the current level of labor underutilization. And it doesn't really capture, it doesn't publish in their monthly reports the disproportionate burden of this type of underemployment, even for what does get reported. And third, because of the great value of the CPS as a monthly consistent tracking device, it does not ask people, as did the people in the previous session, to their credit, about some of the well-being effects. So what we've been doing is tying this in with the various potential harms and hardships that are associated with being partly or partially unemployed. The general economic welfare of the country, the mental health and psychological distress effects, the physical health effects, which interestingly are positive if people work voluntarily part-time. And we've been and will show you our attempt to try to gauge what the effects are on this new measure of part-time unemployment on satisfaction with one's job, on happiness generally, material hardship. Again, it's compounded by having relatively lower minimum pay per hour and benefit coverage in particular. It's a little off topic, but I think this underemployment in people's primary jobs is the main driver of the labor supply side of the gig economy. That's not getting sufficient attention. You might agree with me on that. And it's compounded by the things that the Fair Workweek laws that are going to be addressed later in the session are associated with part-time work. So our research questions are going to be, to what extent is part-time unemployment associated with demographics and some of the working conditions like scheduling, like certain occupations that the great work by Hartman and Schneider are focusing on particular sectors, but is it also associated with other types of occupations or industries? And is it associated with measurable outcomes? Difficult to make causal inferences, but at least some associations. And our two Reference groups will be how does the part-time underemployed compare to the voluntary or hours matched part-time workers and to full-time workers, if that's what they aspire to. So we use the General Social Survey. There was a 10-year gap in the module called the work orientations module, which had, to its credit and to its uniqueness, some questions that we think best would capture underemployment beyond just part-timers who want to work full-time. It includes that, but goes beyond that. So all the caveats apply about cross-sectional data and self-reports and self-rated perceptions. We experimented with various alternative measures. We boil it down in the paper to just two, and that is people who work less than 35 hours, the standard BLS and most countries' estimate of part-time work, but link that with the question where we ask people about their preferences. About 60% of a working population says they prefer their same hours, but a surprisingly high percentage say they want to work either more hours or fewer hours. In the US case, and in most countries' cases for that matter, more people want to work more hours. So we combine the measure with their response to one question with their current employment status. There's another question on that survey that asks, would they prefer to be working part-time or full-time? And so we find those who say they are currently working part-time and want full-time, and this is what we call more an objective measure. It really just means more discrete in their preferred adjustment, and it's closer to that BLS measure of involuntary part-time. And the measures of our outcomes are going to be the job satisfaction, job stress, work-family conflict, general happiness, and the one we focus on in our current version of the paper, even though it's probably kind of obvious that they're underemployed and not happy with their current financial situation or their relative financial status. So the bottom line is going to be anywhere between 7 and 10%. We're going to say about 8 to 9% of current employment is in this situation of being both part-time and wanting more hours. It can be that they don't want to work 35 or a full-time job. It could be that they're getting shorted hours, have their hours cut, not scheduled that week for the preferred number of hours. And that bottom line comes out to about double the rate that you get when you use that CPS generator rate that we went through month to month in the trend. If you just focus in on the part-timers, we get almost 40% of part-timers, almost 4 in 10 part-timers say their preference would be not for same or fewer, but for more hours. Here's some of the descriptives. I bold the categories which I want to draw your attention. On average, the people who are part-time underemployed work remarkably almost exactly half what full-time workers do in the sample. And again, remember, this is from 2016. This is not current. And where possible, we combine it with the 2006. But we see it that women are much more likely or make up a larger percentage of the part-time underemployed population. Blacks and Hispanics also disproportionately. It's pervasive among whites as well, but disproportionately higher among non-whites. It's more about singles, and it's dramatically higher among those that have those short-term or advanced schedules, and particularly among those in the lowest income quintile. When asked about people who do they have a regular shift, a regular shift that's daytime, or regular that's not daytime, but some that are irregular, the part-time underemployed are being fed or positively associated, at least descriptively, with people that say their schedules are decided on short notice by their employer. And in terms of the dependent variables, whether it's a scale, whether it's proportion, you can see that the part-time underemployed, not so much higher work-family conflict than full-time, but much more than people that are part-time and voluntarily so. And that's what we do with our empirical analysis that I'll walk you through right now to confirm that, controlling for all the potential confounders. The main thing we'd find is with alternative measures, there is some sensitivity to how we're measuring part-time in terms of the statistical results. Our sample size is not where it should be by having only 2 years in order to have conclusive results. But we do find enough evidence to suggest that there's some significance for those that are non-white and some significance in terms of the probability of being part-time underemployed in certain occupations. Less so in others, but more so in the service, sales type occupations and the transportation and related occupations. It's among the lowest income quintiles, not surprisingly, have a greater need and desire for more hours to get more income. And the level of hours that they're currently working, kind of surprisingly, did not determine whether or not they were part-time underemployed. In terms of their associations with well-being, not surprisingly, for job satisfaction, people who were part-time underemployed were significantly less satisfied with their jobs. And particularly in the case, even stronger size effect when you compare to those that are voluntarily part-time. So one of the subtexts here is going to be that it's not always about part-time work. It's about whether people prefer to have a part-time job and those hours. There's some association with job stress. There's some association, not surprisingly, with being not too happy, to the happiness question, which spiked incredibly higher than ever before in 2020. Not surprisingly there either. And maybe surprisingly that they do have more work-family conflict than full-time workers, or than voluntary part-time workers, and on par with full-time workers. With the financial dissatisfaction, I just throw all the results at you. Sorry about that. But here is the finding that, not too shockingly, that both measures of our part-time underemployment are associated with the financial dissatisfaction question, not quite so associated with the relative financial status when they compare themselves to others, but it depends on whether we're comparing them to the full-time people or the hours matched people. When we, as a mediating factor, control for whether they have control over their own work hours, that has an important function, which is in the interactions, whether they have no input on their hours, that leads to, or is associated with, the higher work-family conflict. So that control over work hours, we're going to make a segue in a couple of minutes into the policy branch. And if you devote your attention over to the far right side here, it's that having no input on hours does create an important moderating role in terms of being part-time underemployed versus part-time matched. So in sum, we get about 1 in 11 workers, not just 1 in 20 something, that are in this condition of part-time unemployed. It's particularly high among the part-time workers. It had a giant spike upward last spring, and it's been gradually declining since then, as typically happens following a recession. African-American identified and Latinx identified, those with lower household income, singles, and in 3 particular job classifications. This type of underemployment is elevated. And the well-being effects are partly about the financial and partly about their satisfaction with work, their satisfaction with life, their ability to balance work and family demands at the same time. And again, it's not just about part-time work, it's about that there's a preference for more hours or full-time work. It is associated with the schedules being irregular, not necessarily the outcome of job satisfaction or life satisfaction or happiness, but those, well, it is about happiness, but it is associated with this unhappiness and more work-life conflict when independently, when schedules are irregular. So for future research, we want to drill a little bit deeper about other questions you can use on the survey that reflect other features of jobs and employment quality. What is it about being part-time unemployed that that somehow means that even though you have fewer hours, you're just as conflicted over the course of a day, or the time of the survey anyway, with being able to balance work with family demands. As in the previous session, in breakout room stream 3, the associations with health and different measures of health, extremely important. I'm engaged with Jae Sung on using some panel data to try to at least control for previous health, or maybe get fixed effects models where you can see that there's a little clearer causality between the health effects, which may be lagged, of going through a spell of underemployment. In fact, that's going to be one of our issues that I'll conclude with. I'm engaged in other work right now with a macroeconomist, where we're using the CPS's panel feature to look at month-to-month transitions, and finding some similarity that Bradley's paper in the previous session found about unemployment. We're finding similar patterns among underemployment by already vulnerable groups, but not so much differences by gender. So in our conclusion or implications, what is this going to mean that we've gone through this period? Maybe it's not as spiked and long lasting in terms of a spell as it was in the Great Recession, but is this going to be just merely transitory or longer lasting, with some scarring effects of people who have gone through underemployment in 2020 and 2021? The people who are already most vulnerable, they not only experience a greater share of this, but is it also more intensified in terms of the reduction in satisfaction with job and life generally? And what about these policies? So the segue over to Julie will be, and Rachel, and back to Adewale. What does this mean for the structure and implementation and enforcement and effects of the Fair Workweek laws that include ways to have indirect effects on underemployment with some schedule control or more advanced notice, but even more directly, the so-called access to hour provisions, which I'm finding in my discussion with Susan Lambert are very hard to measure and have impact. But in principle, the idea is to give people, when there's a new shift or available hours, employers are supposed to be offering that first to their current workforce or existing workforce, as opposed to hiring temps, hiring new part-timers or full-timers. And this could have made, and maybe did, if we can research this, made some headway into reducing not only the level, but the impact of underemployment coming out of the pandemic recession. So how does this interface with laws that are similar, like rights to request, which might be not so obvious, but somebody who's full-time that wants to be part-time or have reduced hours could free up work, and maybe, not necessarily one-for-one, but translate into more hours, particularly for those that are looking to pick up shifts and looking to pick up additional work hours. And should we include in the Fair Work legislation a minimum hours that some countries and some companies are now doing, to say that if you're part-time, we're not going to put you on a 0 hours contract, as they call it abroad, where some weeks you're going to get really few hours. And we think that that is often what's generating the underemployment, is periodically people are not getting called in or getting called off, and they have really very short hours in a given week. So with that, I pass it over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lonnie. And if you can hang on for just 1 second while I get my slides ready to share here.
Just want to jump in and say, first, thank you, Lonnie. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat for anyone on the panel, Lonnie, Julie, or Rachel.
Just 1 more second. Okay, should be all set, I think. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Julie Boatman, Director of Job Quality with the National Women's Law Center. Thank you so much, Lonnie, for undertaking this research, of course, and for inviting me to be here with you to talk about it today. I feel like I should start out by saying I'm not a social scientist. I'm not an economist. I am a lawyer and a policy advocate. So as Lonnie noted, I'm going to focus on the policy implications and intersections at play here. The research that Lonnie and Jason have done to give us a truer picture of underemployment across the country, the research that Danny Schneider and Kristen Harknett and Peter Fugil and anyone else I'm missing in the audience have undertaken is also incredibly valuable to us, just to help us understand and explain fundamentally how wrong it is to believe that our economy was great until COVID hit. As advocates, we talk a lot about how the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated inequities that have been with us for a long time. And looking at this national data from 2016 really bears that out. So because I'm coming from the National Women's Law Center, it probably won't surprise you that I'd like to spend a little time today focusing on what women in particular are dealing with and what that means for the policy solutions that we're thinking about. So I'll talk about what jumped out for me in this research and how it helps inform our policy work and some of the questions and challenges that are still ahead. That sounds good. So first of all, why are work hours an issue we focus on at the National Women's Law Center? One key reason is that women, especially Black women and Latinas, are particularly likely to hold jobs that are among the lowest paying, and also most likely to feature the kinds of inadequate hours as well as volatile and unpredictable hours that you have heard about today. So we're talking about home care workers and childcare workers and grocery store cashiers and cleaning staff and retail workers and restaurant workers, jobs that many of which we now recognize as essential, but that still leave the women who hold them really underpaid and at risk. And there are also many women who lost their jobs during the pandemic and are struggling to get a foothold as the economy recovers. A second key point is that women who hold these jobs are particularly likely to be both breadwinners and caregivers for their families, which makes these scheduling practices even more problematic, especially in the context of a pandemic that has wreaked havoc on our childcare system. Women in low-paid jobs are much more likely to work part-time than women in the workforce overall. Moms often do so to try to juggle childcare or other family obligations with work, which is, as Lonnie said, that's considered voluntary part-time work under the CPS measure. But as you can see in the chart here, they rarely get the pay or the hours that they need to actually support a family. And the vast majority of Black, Latina, and Native American moms who are working part-time in low-paying jobs have incomes near or below the poverty line. So this lines up with Lonnie's finding that women are more likely than men to be underemployed, and underemployed part-time workers actually face heightened work-family time conflict because, for one, part-time jobs are often accompanied by more volatile hours, more unpredictable hours, little or no paid time off. And number two, as you heard, part-time underemployed workers often have little or no control over their work hours, and therefore little or no control over the extent to which the hours they do work conflict with their family obligations. So we'll turn back to that element of control again when we talk about policy solutions here, but I felt like that was a real theme throughout the paper, that the importance of control in terms of how your part-time hours have positive or negative impacts on the rest of your life. And Lonnie's paper also cites research from Glauber showing that women who involuntarily work part-time have lower median family incomes than women working part-time for reasons that are more voluntary. So from a policy perspective, This emphasizes the importance of thinking about inadequate hours and those unpredictable hours together, and also addressing not only access to hours, but also the penalty that part-time workers experience in terms of pay and benefits and promotion opportunities. And of course, at the National Women's Law Center, we are also always thinking about how race and gender and caregiver status intersect. So, and one more point to note is that it also underscores how the strain of bad work schedules can extend beyond workers themselves to their family members and make it next to impossible to secure and maintain high quality, affordable childcare, which again has disproportionate impacts on the families headed by Black women and Latinas, who are more likely to be trying to support a family on wages that are too low and hours that are too short. And again, Danny Schneider and Kristen Harknett's research it really demonstrates some strong links between work schedules and childcare access and child well-being, again, showing that the more volatility and inadequacy that families experience in their work hours for the parents have negative impacts for their children as well. So how do we fix it? Before I dive into our scheduling policy principles, I do want to note that this is actually just one piece of a much broader policy agenda that we actually need to rebuild an economy that works better for everyone. As these papers acknowledge, underemployment is tied to structural features of our economy and our low-wage labor markets and systemic discrimination, and will require a set of wide-ranging policies to fix. So what I'm focusing on here today is not the thing that will solve all of the problems in our economy. We need universal childcare and paid leave and healthcare and a stronger safety net and everything else that would benefit everyone and complement the policies that we need to make work hours more fair and flexible and adequate. But for purposes of this conversation, I will focus on Fair Workweek policies. And I will note too that research is a critically important part of developing the policy agenda here, which is still a work in progress. I think, again, thanks to all the folks in this virtual room today, who have been focusing on work hours and schedules in recent years, we have a really great foundation. But one of the asks that we as advocates are making of the new administration is to actually put federal dollars and a national focus on the problem of unfair work hours. So like the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, could include questions in the CPS on things like schedule variability and advance notice. So that Lonnie and Jason don't have to undertake all of this work again to actually understand what's really going on in terms of adequacy of work hours. It would also be really valuable to have federal support for evaluations of the Fair Workweek policies that do exist, which there has been some of, again, thanks Danny and Kristen, but we can always use more. So, but again, we do know, thanks to all of your work, that there are millions of people already in this country who are working, who are not getting by, and that their work hours are a big reason for that. So I want to, and that was true even before the pandemic, and we have reason to think that it could easily get worse without policy intervention. So I want to quickly review the key goals that we are trying to serve by these Fair Workweek laws that Lonnie mentioned, and the key provisions that are designed to meet those goals. I'm not going to compare the existing laws in detail, just review the general principles, but then Rachel will be able to speak to some more of the specifics. So the first principle: provide greater employee input into work schedules and respect workers' need for time to rest and manage other obligations. A piece of a Fair Workweek law that is very important to that control element that we've been discussing is these right to request laws, which protect employees who want to request a change in their schedule, a more flexible schedule, or whatever it is, by giving the express right to do so free from retaliation by their employers. And under Seattle's Fair Workweek law, as well as the federal bill, the Schedules That Work Act, those laws also require employers to actually grant certain schedule requests related to major life events like caregiving responsibilities or a second job or education or their own health condition. Although the employer can still deny the request if it has a bona fide business reason. And I know I'm short on time, but I'm just going to run through the rest of the principles before turning it over to Rachel. The right to rest provisions is another important element of control over one's time and being able to plan by preventing clopening, which is the kind of shift where a worker has to close work a closing shift one night and then open the next morning, often with just a few hours in between. That doesn't allow enough time for rest or commuting or anything else. So the right to rest provision requires employers to either allow at least 10 or 11 hours between shifts or pay essentially overtime pay for workers who agree to work hours with less rest. The second key principle here is to provide adequate advance notice of work schedules. That one's pretty simple. Most of the Fair Workweek laws require at least 2 weeks notice. But then to enforce that 2 weeks notice, we have what we call predictability pay, which is a requirement that employers compensate workers for last minute schedule changes within that 2-week time frame. The key idea here is not to penalize employers, but to shift at least some of the costs of unpredictable work schedules back onto employers rather than on the workers who can least afford them. And then finally, most relevant to the paper topic we're discussing today is to expand opportunities for part-time workers through access to hours provisions, which require employers to offer newly available hours to existing employees before making any new hires, as well as part-time parity, which would require employers to treat part-time workers equally to their full-time counterparts with respect to wages and benefits. So with that, unless there are any questions, I will turn it over to Rachel to talk more about the how Fair Workweek laws have been playing out, where they've been enacted and implemented, and what's coming next.
Thanks, Julie. So I just want to kind of add on a little bit of detail to what Julie shared about the policy framework, which is to say that this is a somewhat unique policy framework in that it seeks to incorporate both quite a bit of flexibility for employers, as well as to recognize different preferences that different people have around when and how much they will work. And so when you see, for example, the 2 weeks notice, and as Julie noted, the idea is for employers to compensate people for their flexibility if the schedule is changed after that schedule has been posted. That was, designed to recognize that while, most of the reasons that employers change schedules are not good ones, occasionally there are valid reasons. So the policy does not say set the schedule 2 weeks out and then it cannot be adjusted. In fact, there's quite a bit of flexibility for both employee initiated changes. Shift swaps, right, are a key way that employees have input and flexibility right now, and we certainly want to preserve that. So the real sort of focus here when it comes to advance notice and kind of when employees work is to try to somewhat adjust the current status quo, which is that employees bear the full cost of any unpredictability in the employer's business practices, right? And what some researchers such as Susan Lambert have found is that the majority of changes that happen in retail stores, for example, are not driven by changes in customer demand, but frankly by poor planning on the part of employers. So as an example, if the sort of corporate directors decide to send somebody out for a site visit and don't tell anyone until 2 days before, right? Those are things that are within the employer's control. So I'm noting this because a number of these policies are sort of designed to slightly restore the balance of who's bearing the cost, right? They're not even actually designed to fully require employers to internalize the cost that they're imposing on working people and their families, and the costs that those then generate for society as a whole, under the current status quo of employees being made to bear the full cost of any unpredictability. So with that, I'll also mention that there is most of these policies are focused on particular sectors and are also focused on larger businesses. The vast majority focus on retail, food service, and in some cases, hospitality. The Chicago Fair Workweek ordinance that passed a couple years ago expands to cover as well a number of different sectors, including manufacturing, some healthcare workers, temp agencies, but the majority are more focused, and all of them, almost all of them, are focused on large employers. And one reason for that is because there's been, the larger employers are the ones who are most likely to use workforce management software, which is both kind of the source of a lot of the instability in workers' lives and also a potential solution. So it's very easy to program workforce management technology to ensure that workers are not scheduled for shifts with less than 11 hours of rest, for example. Very easy to program them to offer hours to existing employees before hiring, as the access to hours provisions require. And so there have been the first Fair Workweek law passed in San Francisco in 2014. There are ordinances in place in Seattle, in New York City, in Chicago. There's a state level policy in place in Oregon. Philadelphia also has a Fair Workweek law. Emeryville, which is a small city in the Bay Area that has a lot of retail and chain food service, also passed a law. And there are campaigns in a number of other places. There are also a couple states that have just this sort of right to request language that Julie mentioned before, that have a sort of portion of the Fair Workweek policy. And then the city of San Jose actually passed an access to hours provision by itself, by ballot initiative. And that's one that covers almost every employer with more than 35 employees. So just looking briefly at the questions that were talked about. So there's a question around how access to hours could be strengthened or supplemented to ensure more stable weekly hours or earnings while allowing for voluntary hour reductions. Peter, do you want to say more about that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's something that came out in Lonnie's presentation as, an area that could be developed further in future Fair Workweek laws or other laws. One thing I noticed recently is Illinois, there's a proposed, I believe it's called Employment Security Act, which is primarily focused at sort of just cause dismissal protections, so employment protections against arbitrary firings, but there is a provision about work hour reductions. And the proposed threshold is 15% of usual hours. So if your employer reduces your hours by more than 15%, they'd have to provide, a legitimate reason for that that reduction. I'm not sure where they got that amount, that threshold, or how that would be calculated, but it did get me thinking. Are there ways that we could try to set clearer thresholds around stability in hours, both for workers who are already part-time and looking to move to full-time, or those who might not want to move to full-time, but in some weeks are available to work more hours, thinking of students during vacation periods, for example. Yeah, curious what Julie and Rachel think about those ideas.
Yeah, so I'll come back to that briefly. I just want to kind of highlight a couple other things, which is that thanks to research by Danny and by Kristen, we actually have now kind of an assessment about how these laws work in practice. And so when the Seattle Secure Scheduling Law was passed, it required an evaluation both of workers' experience and of managers and companies implementing the law. And so what Danny and Kristen were able to evaluate was that even in the second year of the law being in effect, there were pretty significant improvements in people's experiences. And one of the things that I think is sort of critical about that is that is true despite what is likely a very subpar enforcement environment. So the first year study found really wide variation between employers in terms of whether they were implementing the Fair Workweek Law or trying to evade the Fair Workweek Law. And I want to note that particularly the anecdotal information collected around employer practice showed or indicated the likelihood of substantial non-compliance with the access to hours provision. So several managers indicated, oh yeah, I give my employees hours if they want them, but only up till 25 hours a week because that's the corporate practice, that's the max, right? Which is a flagrant violation of the policy, right? But we have a significant disconnect between corporations kind of apparently not adjusting their practices that hinge on maintaining a large pool of underemployed workers who will then be available for last minute shifts, and the locations that require offering existing employees hours before hiring externally. So to see the positive impact that the Fair Workweek Law has had in Seattle, despite likely, having pretty broad variations in terms of whether employers are actually complying, to me indicates that the value of this policy, and particularly the importance of pairing it with mechanisms for strong enforcement, for strong worker education about about their rights, and empowering workers to kind of enforce their rights under these Fair Workweek laws. In terms of the access to hours question, one of the things that we have been trying to do as we see how these laws are being implemented in different places, and then kind of evaluating and adjusting our policy recommendations, there has been some adjustment in terms of how we're thinking about how that provision can best be implemented. And so the early laws really have been very process heavy, right? You post the law, you post the opportunity, you have to let it simmer for a few days, then that the employer has to provide some different, has to sort of clarify to employees how it will distribute hours among workers if there are multiple people who are interested in the hours. When the Connecticut, Danny mentioned Connecticut evaluating a Fair Workweek policy that passed in the Senate about a week ago, had some sort of a simpler approach of requiring employers to solicit from employees what are their preferences in terms of when and how many hours they want to work, and then to review those preferences when assigning work hours before any new hires. The policy that Peter noted really grows out of the New York City fast food workers campaign. So fast food workers in New York have been really at the forefront of the Fair Workweek movement, and had passed the strongest, I think, existing Fair Workweek policy in the country is the one that governs fast food workers in New York City, which, in addition to requiring access to hours, had sort of strong preferences for people within an existing store, because there have been patterns within the fast food industry of bringing in people from a different store to displace people who've already worked in that location. And they won one of the first just cause standards, right, around protection from arbitrary firings. One of the things that their members had discussed was that there were that reductions in hours can basically create a constructive discharge, right? So we see this all the time as a form of retaliation where people are just taken off the schedule entirely, or their hours are significantly reduced, or they may see that they're scheduled at a time that their employer knows that they're not available. So the incorporation of that 15% reduction was a way of sort of how are employers going to try to get around this kind of ban on arbitrary or retaliatory terminations by simply reducing people's hours to the point where they will then quit. And so that was part of the just cause update to the just cause law. Also updated the Fair Workweek law in New York City, and I think other groups that are looking at just cause are looking to incorporate that as well. So I think in terms of a tech fix, in terms of adapting software, I don't think that you have to have technology to comply with Fair Workweek laws. And I think it varies in terms of the policy. For really tracking when the schedule is posted, what changes are made to it, who's initiated those changes, that I think is certainly much easier to do when you are using workforce management technology that can track, from which device or computer, a change was initiated or by what user. When you're talking about access to hours, I don't think you need any technology support really at all to implement that kind of standard. I think there are also, some in terms of the question of stability, right? There's no piece of the Fair Workweek law that says you have to provide consistent hours in terms of the same number of hours from week to week, or the same times, or the same days, right? That is not something that we have really developed like a policy solution for that can be applicable across a wide variety of workforces. I think the hope is that the only way for employers to truly comply with access to hours is by taking a step back from the just-in-time scheduling model and the volatile model, and thinking about more consistent scheduling, or potentially core scheduling, right? Where people have the same shifts and hours week to week as a baseline, and then an ability to potentially, flex up when there's more work that's required. So I think the hope is that the policies will indirectly lead to more stability in terms of the time and the quantity of hours. The last thing I'll say briefly is that I think this is a really, really important time for additional research around underemployment. And we're in we saw this sort of spike in involuntary part-time work after the last recession that never fully kind of went down, and I think very likely that we are seeing similar things as people are being forced off of unemployment, forced to take jobs where they don't have access to reliable childcare at all of the times that they might need to. And a lot of the debate that's been happening now around hiring really focuses on wages, and there's barely any discussion about whether the employers that are complaining they can't hire are also offering any minimum guaranteed hours, whether they offer employees, any input in their work schedules. I think there is a major failure by a lot of reporters that look at business and economics to sort of factor in the full picture in terms of job quality. And I would love to hear if folks are looking at any kind of immediate research in this area that we can kind of continue to do the public education that we need to do about the job quality, particularly in the hospitality, retail food sectors.
Well, I want to thank Rachel, Julie, and Lonnie for all the work that you all have done, as well as everyone else within the audience who are also uplifting this very important issue. As you can see, this is very important. So just want to say thank you all. I think we only have a minute, so we don't really have time for any more questions, but what I'll say is just thank you all for joining us. And if you all need anything, you guys can contact Lonnie, Julie, Rachel, or I for any questions, concerns, or for Lonnie's paper. Thank you, everyone.